Welcome to Hospice Explained. This podcast is intended as an educational aid and is only a resource to begin to understand the end-of-life season. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please always seek advice from your physician or qualified members of your healthcare team with any questions regarding a medical condition.
Hello and welcome to Hospice Explained. I'm your host, Marie Betcher. I'm a registered nurse. I'm a former hospice nurse. I started this podcast to educate patients and families on hospice and the end-of-life season. And on this episode, I am interviewing Rachel Waters. In early 2025, Rachel became a national figure when she was indicted for the death of her own mother, a tragedy that began while she was acting as her caregiver during hospice. Prosecutors alleged she had administered a lethal dose of morphine, a standard medication in hospice settings. Rachel faced murder charges and the possibility of the death penalty. After intense public scrutiny and legal battles, all charges were dropped in August 2025. Today, Rachel is using her experience to drive systematic change. She openly speaks about the legal gray areas families and caregivers face in end-of-life care, the lack of oversight and education in hospice medication protocols, and the urgent need for compassionate policy reform to protect both patients and those who care for them. With a background in nonprofit communications and life sciences writing, Rachel bridges the gap between lived experience and actionable insight. And audience, just so you know, I did not do a lot of conversation in this episode. I really just listened to Rachel's story. I'm really grateful for Rachel because of her experience. It's going to help improve the future for other patients and families. Welcome, Rachel, to Hospice Explained. Rachel has a huge story. And Rachel, I want you to start where you want to start telling my audience about your story.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it as succinct as I can because this can go a little long in places. But, to kind of start off, my story really begins around the time of the pandemic. My mom and I were always close all my life, only child. She was divorced. And we were in constant contact. Even after I moved to New York City back in 2012, I had been living next door to her until then. So I was 29. I moved to New York. And we had the type of relationship where if we weren't talking or texting every day, we were planning to visit each other. And that was usually around 4 times a year, twice her coming to New York, and then 2 times a year, usually around the holidays, me coming down to Georgia. So we had a lot of contact. So January 2020 was the last time before the pandemic I'd seen my mom. We spent like a couple of weeks with her for the holidays, and everything seemed very normal. She was always the person in the family that people, if they bet money, who was most likely to live to 100, it was her, right? And so she was just about to turn 70, or no, she was 70 at the time, sorry. And everything was fine. I was planning to visit her for her birthday in March of 2020, but just before her birthday, pandemic hits, shutdown, life changes for everybody overnight.
Right.
And over the coming months, while we were texting and talking, I began to notice that her speech was getting increasingly garbled and strange. She started using a lot of grammatically incorrect phrasing, reversing pronouns constantly. And I had been on the lookout for signs of Alzheimer's for a while because in 2017, we had both done a 23andMe and we both learned that we had the ApoE4 gene, also known as the Alzheimer's gene. So when you have one copy of that, that's about a 20% lifetime risk, or risk until you're about 80 of developing it. So when I realized that my mom was having these serious cognitive symptoms, all the red flags went off. And my husband and I immediately started making plans to get down to Georgia as quickly as we could. We got down in August, and my mom looked like she had aged 20 years in 8 months. Her entire spinal column had basically collapsed from severe osteoporosis. And what we didn't know at the time was probably the early stages of multiple myeloma bone lesions.
Oh.
And even though she seemed like her old self. She'd also lost about, 15 pounds, right? And that looks quite dramatic on someone with a small frame.
Yeah.
But it was also clear to me that she probably at least had mild cognitive impairment. So I got her in with a gerontologist so we could get the osteoporosis treated and get her evaluated. And sure enough, her score on the MoCA, she was right at that borderline between MCI and Alzheimer's. And I had to jump into action. And that began my journey as a caregiver. Unfortunately, that journey progressed much faster than any of us could have appreciated. It was actually breathtaking speed, because she had these complicating factors of both osteoporosis and then the multiple myeloma, which she was formally diagnosed with in the summer of 2022. At that point, she was still kind of middle stage Alzheimer's. She was able to live at home with a lot of support still. But after the cancer, and especially when she failed the cancer therapy, we didn't put her through chemo, but monoclonal antibody therapy. We wanted to try and buy some quality of life.
Okay.
That was when things really got bad, was toward the end of 2022. She had failed therapy. The multiple myeloma was advancing. And that was when her oncologist said, I think that it's time for hospice. I think between the Alzheimer's and the cancer, I don't really see her living another year, maybe not even 6 months. And I think that's kind of what we're looking at now. And so she went into home hospice.
Okay.
And she was still living at her private house at the time. And when she went into hospice, we went through all the usual training you get. And like many Americans, millions of Americans, we also received a prescribed comfort care kit, which I'm sure you're familiar with, right? It
Yes.
has the medications like sublingual morphine and lorazepam and suppositories for constipation. And we were trained on how to use it with the expectation that, if she began to experience really distressing symptoms at end of life and there was no professional available, we would be able to administer these. And you don't really think anything of it when this is prescribed to you. I certainly didn't. I had friends who were hospice nurses. This all seemed to be within the normal order of things. Unfortunately, my mom's care needs began to progress so rapidly that even with 24/7 hired in-home care, the home itself was no longer becoming safe. And we were there alternating with care too, because we would spend at least 2 weeks out of the month there
Wow.
at that stage. And at one point, we were there for like 2.5 months solid from New York.
Sure.
And I was still working, right, full time, which became very hard as a caregiver,
Oh, yeah.
trying to juggle my career and also a staff of people that we had hired to look after her. But when the home was no longer safe, we made the very difficult decision to move her into a memory care facility in March of 2023. Now, it's important to note that memory care facilities are not actually medical facilities. They are considered assisted living. They are residential facilities. They can have medical staff on hand, including nurses and certified nursing assistants, but those staff are not there necessarily 24/7. And when someone is on hospice already, they stay on hospice, on the same hospice. It's still considered home hospice because the care is delivered in the home. This is important because even though she moved into the facility, nothing really changed on my end except medications that I had been picking up at home were prescribed to the facility. They kept the comfort care kit at home, weren't even thinking about needing it at the time. I just assumed the facility would get one too. But that was like, it all felt very within the normal of order of things. My mom, unfortunately, progressed even more rapidly at that point, which was right along the timeline that the oncologist had told us to expect. She was eating less and less and less and losing just a rapid amount of weight. It was really shocking. I think by the time she collapsed in July of 2023, she was 76 pounds
Wow.
and her back completely folded in half. She was at a full right angle at that point
Oh.
because the multiple myeloma lesions had I think when they did the MRI of her spine, they described it as like paper mache with holes in it.
So sad.
And so we knew that the end was coming, especially since her dementia was also rapidly progressing. They all sort of fed into one another. And so on July 9th of 2023, I was at home with my husband and I got a call from hospice that my mom had been found doubled over, non responsive, with an oxygen saturation in the 70s and her toes and fingers turning black, and that she was declared actively dying and that there were maybe just hours to days left for her to live. So I needed to get down immediately. And we flew into action. There was a huge storm in New York at the time, so we could not fly out of New York. We actually had to take a train to Washington, D.C., took an Amtrak there, then took a plane to Georgia. We got down on the 10th, set up our bed in her room. And sure enough, when we saw her, she had already gone a day at this point without, any food, any fluids. Again, she's non-responsive. So all you have is like the little sponges that you can kind of dip in water and they'll have like that sucking reflex. But
Yeah.
that's kind of the extent of it. Her skin was starting to turn a bit sallow. She just appeared to be paralyzed. At the time I arrived, I could not figure out like what could be going on, if it was a massive stroke, but it was very clear she was at the end of life. And one of the things that struck me was when she was turned, she had two very large, either bedsores or Kennedy ulcers. We don't know which, but they were large blisters on her hip and back. And the only responsiveness she had was when turned, she would make these really agonized expressions. And so I asked the hospice nurse, hey, can we get morphine prescribed to the facility, as a regular medication? Because I knew as a medical writer that is the standard of care at end of life is some palliative morphine. And she said, well, she appears to be comfortable. We'll ask the doctor about it. And I was like, okay, we'll see. The next day comes around. It's not prescribed to the facility. I ask again, kind of get the same. She looks comfortable. I'll ask the doctor. Nothing. And at this point, we've gone another day, no food or fluids. And my mom, now we've progressed to the point where her eyes are actually desiccated. And it was really distressing to see. But she's still showing these signs of distress, and her breathing is getting increasingly labored. Like she's using her jaw more to breathe. And I knew that was, well, I Googled too. And I was like, oh my God, it looks, like she's progressing some diagonal breathing, but then it would calm down. And so I just said, okay, we'll wait. But my husband and I had talked, and he was like, look, if they don't get morphine to the facility, we at least have the comfort kit that we can get from the house. And so he went and got it and kept it in the car. Again, thinking, this is the training, just in case something happens, we at least have this. And I never would have imagined that would have been an issue in any world. And this is important for the rest of the story, because there had been nothing that led me to believe that it was, right? Especially since this was her residence. We weren't in a hospital or in a nursing home. And I had checked like the legal designations too, to be sure. I was like, okay, everything's on the up and up. It's still considered home hospice. And unfortunately, the morning of July 12th at about 4:30 in the morning, my husband and I were awakened by the sound of smashing teeth. And that was the extremely intense agonal breathing. It was a really horrifying sight. It was her lower jaw was jutting very, very hard. Her eyes were more open than they had been before, but they did not look. They had been partially open and wouldn't close, but it was very disturbing.
You felt she was suffering.
Yes,
Okay.
it looked pretty much like suffering to me. And at this point, I am panicked and I'm like, okay, I think this is what the comfort kit's for. But I need to first make sure if the facility has a prescription or not, because I don't want to be responsible for administering medication if there's someone who's qualified to do it here. So I checked with them. No prescription had been called in yet. And at that point, I was like, okay, I can at least call hospice for guidance. I did. I described her symptoms and I received guidance for the sublingual morphine. And I let everyone at the facility that night know. I was like, look, I've just talked to hospice. I have, her comfort care kit from home. I'm going to administer the dose and see if it helps. And, one of them didn't really want anything to do with it. The other was like, well, she sure needs morphine, and kind of walked off. And it didn't really make a difference. Unfortunately, she died within the hour anyway, with no real difference to her breathing. And it was agonizing, but nothing seemed unusual. Hospice came and declared her a couple of hours later. They dressed her, they bathed her. Family came and said goodbyes. I called the funeral home to make arrangements to pick her up. And they said, oh, we're going to be a few hours delayed. So you guys go home, get some rest. And so we did. And on the way home, home being my mom's old house, which was about 20, 30 minutes away,
Okay.
I get a call from the funeral home and they said, there's a problem. We can't pick up your mom's body. There's an investigation and her body's been taken to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's crime lab in Atlanta.
Oh my goodness.
And I realized then there's only one reason why. And my first thought was, oh my God, there's been a terrible mistake. Maybe one of the aides I talked to, I didn't know what was going on. I just knew that I had almost certainly been implicated in her death. And in that instant, I went from a grieving daughter to someone who was terrified for her own life because
Wow.
that's just, I've never had any adverse, or any kind of encounter with law enforcement in my life that was adverse. It was just absolutely terrifying. So I immediately Googled the first attorney, like criminal defense attorney I could find in that part of Georgia. And I told him what happened. I told him what was going on. I was like, I didn't. And he was like, well, giving morphine to another person's illegal. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's part of hospice. And he was like, well, if what you say is true, then there shouldn't be an issue. And he said, but, you can expect law enforcement to show up any moment now, and you need to be prepared. And he was like, because if they charge you, it could be anything from, manslaughter to felony murder.
Wow.
And of course, at that point, I'm like, felony murder, what the hell's that? And I'm Googling that too. And I'm just terrified about what could possibly be happening. And my husband's like just reeling because it's so very surreal. We can't even process that my mom has just died, much less that suddenly I have been thrown into a completely alien world. And sure enough, within about 30 minutes of getting back to my mom's house, there's a knock at the door, and it's two investigators as well as backup, and they're asking for my phone. And I said, you can speak to my attorney. I was way too emotional to talk to anybody, and I know my rights. I was like, you can speak to my attorney and you can get a search warrant for the phone. They did speak to the attorney, and they came back about 2.5, 3 hours later with a search warrant for my phone and for the morphine prescription. And when I handed it over, I felt this relief. I was like, okay, they're going to go through my phone unlocked. They're going to see that I was called down because she was dying. They're going to see that I called hospice and sought guidance before her death. They're going to see that the morphine is barely used. They're going to see that it's a prescription. I felt like very quickly the misunderstanding would be cleared up. As scared as I was like, there's just an abundance of evidence that this was a misunderstanding. Unfortunately, it was just silence after that for 19 months.
Interesting. Wow.
And for 19 months, I was just a suspect. And in that time, you can't settle a person's estate. You can't get life insurance because there's an active investigation into you. It's, a lot of people aren't aware of the Slayer statute, where if there's even the slightest chance you may have been involved in someone's death, you're not going to get the life insurance. So you can't really move forward in any way. You're just sort of paralyzed. And I was certainly paralyzed in that grief too, because I also wanted to know what happened to my mom. I didn't know how long she'd been collapsed, who found her, what exactly happened that, instigated her death. And I also wanted to know. And so I was calling and looking for answers with the medical examiner, like, hey, did we get results back? Is toxicology back? Like, can we just, move forward and release the records? Again, not imagining in any world that there's any sort of charge pending, knowing that, I did everything on the up and up. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Yeah, well, it gets stranger. A couple of days before my 42nd birthday celebration, so it was funny. It was like, no, it was the day before. We had people coming over the very next day. I'm scrolling through Instagram, and I had made a post about the last birthday gift my mom had ever given me, which was teaching me how to paint because she was a great painter. And on that post, an anonymous person had commented, Shame on you. Why did you kill your mom? This is why your family has disowned you. And then they posted a copy. So my family had stopped talking to me after my mom's death. And I guess that was the reason. They posted a copy of a very official looking indictment with a number, and it had two charges: felony murder and malice murder, which are the most serious charges that anyone can face. They carry the weight of the death penalty
Oh my goodness.
as a possibility. We were terrified. Like, my husband was scrambling. He's like, maybe this is like an elaborate like scam and someone found out you're a suspect and they're trying to blackmail you for money, but something deep down told me it was real. And I sent the screenshot to the attorney who had initially consulted me, almost 2 years ago at that point. And I said, "Is this real?" And he said, "Yes, there is an active warrant for your arrest. They could be at your door at any minute."
Oh my goodness.
And he was like, "You need to make arrangements to turn yourself in, and you need legal counsel from the only person in the country I would have if something like this happened to me, and that's Brian Steele." And I was like, "Brian Steele, he's a famous attorney. He defended Young Thug in like the famous, like the longest case, I think, in Atlanta court history."
Okay.
And I was like, "There's no way he's going to take my case. A, I couldn't afford him, and B, he's way too famous." And he said, "No, he will. I have him on the phone." And that night at like midnight, Brian Steele and his wife got on the phone with me and were like, "We stand with you. We are one. We will get through this." And from there, they made arrangements for me to turn myself in the following week. And this was the funny thing about the birthday. I still had the party. I just announced to all of my friends what was about to happen to me and what the journey ahead was. Because I'm a pretty transparent person, and pretty much everyone in my life knew I was a suspect, and that's what I had been going through. But now they knew everything had changed, and I definitely needed people around me in that moment because I felt like I was going to dissolve. My adrenaline, like before I went to turn myself in, it was a span of like 5 or 6 days, I believe. I need to double check that, but I lost 10 pounds in that time. I could not eat.
Wow.
Any food you put in your mouth, you just want to throw up because your stomach's way too tight. And I had to be driven down to Georgia because I was technically a fugitive, so you can't fly, or else you'll be arrested, and you can't drive, right? But luckily we got down, and I turned myself in the morning of my bond hearing at 5 a.m. I went through all the processing, right? Mugshot, stripped down, showered off, orange jumpsuit, put medium security. I was lucky to get medium security with those charges because I was cooperative and had turned myself in. And then I waited for my bond hearing. I was deeply fortunate that my entire community, from Georgia to New York, people even flew down, turned out in full force in the courtroom to vouch for me and my reputation, to put their money, their freedom on the line for me, to say, "Rachel is not going to run. She is not a threat to her community. And we are willing to put everything we have up for that, including passports, wealth, you name it, and speak before the judge." I was also lucky because the district attorney chose to not fight bond. She started telegraphing some unusual things during the bond hearing where there was, she said, I think, if she did it, it doesn't seem to have been in malice or for any financial gain. And, I talked to the siblings, my mom's siblings, right? And they said she was in terrible cancer pain. And so it was mercy and not malice if she did it. And so it was kind of an unusual statement because it was a little bit of a backtracking, right? Because one of the charges was malice murder. And she approached the bench and made it clear she was not going to fight bond. And thankfully, because DAs usually do, that's usually their duty, right? The judge granted me $200,000 bond, and I was released
Okay.
and able to go home and gather the abundance of evidence I had, because at this point, I'm like, okay, I feel like they might be missing something because some of the evidence they used was kind of unusual. Like from my phone, I was really surprised to learn that they had used that I had searched for charges after my mom died. And I was like, yeah, because I was told what was happening to me.
Right.
Of course, it's the first thing you do is you Google it. And I was like, I can fill in a lot of blanks for people. And luckily, being out enables you to kind of go through all of your records. And because I had concerns around my mom's death, particularly around the care she was receiving, I had begun to document everything. I had taken a lot of video, I had recorded conversations. I had just been really meticulous in gathering medical records as well for the days leading up to her death. And at this point, news articles are coming out and they're really confusing to me because they're saying things like unprescribed morphine. And I'm like, well, I have a photo of the morphine prescription. And one article even said injected. And I was like, wait, hold on. My mom was hospitalized at the ER 5 days before she died. Like she had an IV mark from that. So there seemed to me to be some confusion about kind of what went on at some point. And seeing this and all the evidence I had, we got discovery from the prosecutor's office. And, you know, we were able to look at their evidence and say, we have a ton of evidence on our end that I think should be made available, that we think should be made available to the medical examiner that had originally ruled her death. On the autopsy report, he notes kidney failure, acute extensive liver necrosis, mild bilateral pneumonia, 70% artery blockage, brainstem atrophy, myeloma lesions throughout the brain and skull. I forget what else, right? But her morphine levels, there were like 420 nanograms per deciliter, which is right on the kind of on the lower end of what sometimes is seen in overdose cases. But morphine postmortem redistribution is a huge thing with morphine.
Right.
And context for how people die is also important. Now, we had a ton of context. And I can't say exactly what piece of context was maybe missing from the medical examiner's perspective. But some of the context we had was, for instance, that my mom was declared actively dying and had no food or fluids in the days leading up to her death without any real urination or defecation either. We also had the video documentation of how she looked in the days and hours leading up to her death. And we had the prescription information. And all we know is that when we sent that information to the medical examiner and he evaluated it, he changed the cause of death. He updated it. It was no longer a homicide. It was then undetermined, right? So it's then in the state's hands. And the DA, she also got all the same evidence as well as eyewitness affidavits, including one from my friend who is a hospice nurse herself. She's a very long-term friendly friend. She was coming in and seeing my mom every day as she was dying. And she immediately dropped all charges and the case was dismissed.
Wow. That is one wow story.
Yeah.
That's just awful. This whole story is
I
so
will say we
awful.
are exploring legal options right now and have
Oh, okay.
consulted with a civil team. Yeah.
I gotta I'm so speechless. I knew the story was going to be similar to what you said because I read it, but
Mhm.
what makes you tell me, I don't know, why would anybody one dose is more of morphine, correct?
Mhm. Yep. Just the one.
Your mother was dying and she was in pain, and I feel like it's the hospice doctor didn't even acknowledge it when you kept calling.
We don't understand why she was not prescribed morphine at end of life to the facility.
No, it's poor care. Well, I will just be honest. I feel like it's poor care and it's not standard of practice. I know the doctors will
Mhm.
often order something. If you say they're uncomfortable, please let me give the morphine
Yeah.
that's already been prescribed just for comfort and ease because the death is going to happen irregardless of the morphine.
Yeah.
I don't think that dose of morphine made a difference, be honest.
No, and she was not opioid naive. She had had a fentanyl patch for the cancer pain for months.
Mm.
Um,
Rachel is basically saying her mom could handle the dose is what makes sense to me because she's
mhm.
already on a narcotic. Fentanyl is a narcotic and patches are often used.
Yeah.
Oh, this is such a sad. I'm so grateful that some people got some wisdom, but where are you at now? What are you going to do with all this?
What am I going to do with all this? I am going to do every single thing within my power to ensure this never happens to another person ever again. And I say that because millions, millions of Americans will have a loved one die in home hospice, and they will be prescribed a comfort kit. And if something like this happened to me, it will happen again to someone else. It's just that's what happens when, that's how we get laws right, is something terrible happens that sets a precedent. As far as I know, my case is the first of its kind in the country. And I've searched high and low. My attorneys have searched high and low. We could not find any other precedent of someone with an actively dying loved one who had a comfort care kit and was charged with murder after being called down because that loved one was found and declared actively dying. We are,
It's not logical.
no,
It's just not even literally logical. An actively dying person is going to die with or without medications. It just is more comfortable and
right.
humane to give them something.
Yeah, and I was really tortured by the agonal breathing. I felt at that point, oh my God, thank God I have this comfort care kit because it was just tearing apart my soul to see that respiratory distress and the reality of what it looks like. I have PTSD from it. I still have night terrors of it regularly.
Absolutely realistic.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry about your mom. I'm sorry about everything you went through. My goodness.
Thank you. Yeah, my mom was my world. And what was so, you talk about what I'm going to do, but I do want to talk about something that's really striking that happened after I was charged. And it's so important, I think, for people to know. A lot of people were sympathetic and but they believed I did it, right? They were like, well, her mom had Alzheimer's, she had cancer, I don't blame her for putting her out of her misery. And all I wanted to do, like screaming, right? Was wait a minute, a morphine overdose is not a pleasant way to die. And that is not how anybody should look at this. Like you should not try and overdose your loved one. Like this is not how terminal sedation or what have you. Like there's a reason when people, are put to death by the state, they don't just give them an overdose of morphine. There's a lot of other drugs there. There's propofol. It's just not a way to go. And it was not something I would ever even dream, even if my mom had begged me, dream of risking. But my mom also, she wanted to die a natural death with comfort care. And for me, my number one priority was to carry out those wishes, to have her die the natural death she wanted, but with adequate comfort care. And that was what I carried out to the best of my ability. And to think that the penalty I paid for that was losing my career, losing my entire life savings, losing my reputation, losing my family, that was the price I paid. The problem is, if this happens to somebody else, they will lose so much more because most people don't have a spare life savings to pay bond or legal fees. Most people don't have the legal or medical understanding to have adequate documentation that is exculpatory, right? Or evidence to innocence or evidence of no wrongdoing, like I had.
Right.
People, when they are caught in the criminal legal system, they might spend, especially if there is no bond set, which in cases of murder, there often isn't, right? So you will have people, even if they have evidence, unable to gather it. They may not be able to afford anybody but a public defender. And those people can often end up taking plea deals, but their lives would be shattered. And the idea that someone else's life would be shattered because their loved one inevitably dies in hospice and someone says, well, this morphine wasn't authorized, or we don't think it was authorized, or there's no, record of them being able to give it. And that could be claimed somehow, either by a family member or a professional or another care provider. That was terrifying to me. And that was when I really began to search what are the laws out there protecting caregivers when they receive comfort care kits. And that's where I learned there aren't any.
Interesting.
There are not. There are no explicit protections for caregivers when it comes to administering end of life medications, especially controlled substances. And it's probably because there has not been a precedent like this, right? Someone has to fight for that law. And that is what I've set out to do. I have spoken to probably 7 or 8 different hospice professionals at this point, you being another, about the variation in comfort care practices kind of across states, from company to company, individual to individual. I know some people are like, yeah, we were given the comfort care kit from the moment they go into hospice, as was in my case. You get some training on it, and then you get like the emergency number to call for further guidance if, the time comes to administer it.
Right.
Some people I've spoken to, they don't really get any guidance at all. Other people, they pick up the comfort care kit when their loved one starts to really progress at the end. But in all of the cases, I asked, is there any documentation of the administration of these medications by family members to loved ones that's required? And many of them said, no, there isn't. And so my thought was, what if, and this is something that would have certainly made a huge difference in my case, what if during these regular visits, the family keeps a log of comfort care medication use, how much is given, what were the symptoms that triggered it, and the nurse that comes in just basically validates this information on their own records too. They don't have to actually measure out each individual thing, but they can get a rough estimate, within their professional judgment and say, hey, it looks like the family is engaging in appropriate use. Sounds good. And so that way, when you get to end of life, you have a record of what the use pattern looks like. And if there's any huge dramatic difference, in the amount of medication left at the end or not, should any accusations or charges arise, you then have an official record of, yes, we knew the family member had these comfort medications and we knew they were administering it. Because it seemed in my case, there was one witness they interviewed that did say, oh, she was probably trained on the medications, but that there was no official record, right? Of, me being allowed to administer them, for instance, because comfort care medications, they're prescribed in the dying person's name. And to a lay person, like who's never had a loved one in hospice, it might sound crazy to them that the idea that a lay person like me could give morphine to my loved one. They think of that often as something only a doctor can do. And if that person's in law enforcement, it's understandable where they would go, well, she couldn't just put morphine in my mouth. Why would she be allowed to put it in her mother's, right? And I'm not saying that's what happened in my case, but if you don't have a documented record where professionals are saying, yes, this is an expected use of this medication, we do expect family members to use them at end of life, then something like this can absolutely happen to someone else. And if there had been a record of that, in my case, this never would have happened to me.
I totally see where you're going with that. That makes sense.
And the other thing is it also protects hospice companies too, right?
Right.
Showing like they're doing their due diligence. So it's this sort of three-way protection, because my other big fear is that once my story gets out, what happens to people who have loved ones in hospice care who are now terrified to give comfort care medications?
Well, that's what's kind of going through my mind as we're talking. I just don't want people to fear doing it. But you do want to have this, you want to administer appropriately as you're educated. And if you have questions,
That's right.
you call
Mm-hmm.
your team, you call your hospice nurse, you call the after hours nurse, you
That's
reach
right.
out. You do not do it if you're not comfortable. You do not do it if you don't have education. You don't let somebody in the family who's got a problem with drugs
That's right.
touch the medicine. I've definitely been out on visits where we had to just plain old say, I need to count your pills.
Yeah.
But I've been out on it several times where it was like,
Mm-hmm.
you've asked for this prescription refill and you just got one. And why
Right.
are you, if you're taking it at XYZ, so
Yeah. And God forbid a family member accuses hospice, or implicates hospice in something because that prescription keeps getting refilled and they think it's shady. Hence Marsha's law. Marsha's law is that been very narrowly designed to strictly document the use of those comfort care medications by the family and have those validated and made into a record. It's an additional piece of paperwork, not ideal, but the last thing I want to do is to have comfort care medications taken out of the family's hands of family members, because hospice, the foundation of hospice rests on that home hospice. But I also want to be sure that people don't have to fear some sort of legal repercussion if, say, a family member goes, "Ooh, we didn't expect him to die that soon. We're going to implicate you." And for all you know, a hospice company might say, "Well, we don't want anything to do with this necessarily." And they may or may not volunteer that information. But if there's an official record and there's can be a warrant sent for that official record, whether or not someone speaks, at least that's there, right?
Yes.
Because you can't rely on witness testimony. You need something that's validated.
Interesting. Wow.
Because people get scared when they speak to law enforcement too, and they may not mention that. There's too much room for, I think, human error, and I want to eliminate that with Marsha's law and ensure that caregivers are protected.
How long will that take to get enacted, the law to does it take a few years
It will
maybe?
take as long as it takes.
Okay.
Sometimes it can happen relatively quickly. So, part of the reason, and actually the reason, right, that I'm going on podcasts and doing interviews is the first phase of it is raising awareness and magnifying that this is a real thing that can happen to real people, even when hospice instructions and guidelines are followed and there's no deviation from that. And the awareness is the first step. And then as that starts to gain momentum, you can bring it in front of state and federal representatives, ideally federal, especially those who are interested in end of life care, hospice care, elder care. And especially if you've already partnered with another hospice organization or other hospice professionals and palliative care organizations to sort of lend legitimacy and say, hey, we agree, if this law were in place, this wouldn't have happened to this person. And we definitely need to make sure it never happens again. And at that point, you have momentum, right? Because you've had news stories, hopefully, that have validated it. You've told the story enough. You have enough professionals and professional organizations and nonprofits who can go to the federal level, especially since almost all hospice, right, is Medicare, right? So it's a federal program, and say, we need this additional law in place to protect family caregivers at end of life. And at that point, it's a matter of who chooses to pick it up. Hopefully, in my hope is that this will be seen for what it is, which is a truly bipartisan law. But you never know, in the current political environment, anything could happen. But I'm hopeful. My goal would be within the year. But if it takes a couple of years, it takes a couple of years. But I feel that I owe it to everything my mom endured and to her legacy and to the other people that this may happen to who will not be as lucky as me, to do everything within my power to make it a reality. And that's why I said at the beginning, I am in many ways the best possible person that this could have happened to, because I have the connections and the understanding of communications and how these systems work enough that I can, step into that forum and try and make that a reality. And other people don't necessarily have that privilege. And I feel my mom raised me with a set of principles that I am obligated to live up to. I could not sleep at night if I did not. So, as long as it takes is the answer.
Okay. Well, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about your mom. I'm so sorry what you went through, Rachel. Your story is wow. It's horrifying, to be honest, that you couldn't even grieve your mom, and you're still, I mean, we're just a few months. I mean, we're recording this mid-November
Yeah.
of 2025, and you just barely got to stop thinking about it. Now you're working on a law. I hope you do take a couple pauses and begin to grieve your mom. I'm so sorry.
I think that'll begin when I am able to go down and start sorting through her estate.
Yeah.
I've been kind of waiting to do it, but I know it's going to be a deluge, right?
Yeah.
It will come. Of course, you lose valuable time and like there are memories that have already faded simply because of time and trauma, which are really difficult for part of that mourning process. And also having my family no longer talk to me, that was a huge part of the grieving that I was hoping to be able to participate in, talk to them about all their memories of her as a child. And they have not spoken to me or reached out to me even after the case was dismissed, despite me reaching out to them.
That is so sad.
So it's been heartbreaking on multiple levels, but I I have an amazing community of people around me and an amazing support network. And if I can make this a reality, if I can spare somebody else this kind of agony or worse while they're trying to grieve their dying loved one, it would have been worth it, even if it's just one other person.
Seriously, yes. Bless you. That's all I can say. Bless you for doing this. That what you've gone through, and you're making something positive come out of something so negative.
That's kind of how I'm wired, just sort of shrinking back and being like, well, I hope the bad press goes away and just go back to like living my life the way it was before. There's no going back after this. There's just a before and an after. And, once you're free, it's on you to determine what that after looks like. And so I tell people that, even though it's still a tragedy and it's gutting, this is at least the good part of the story where I can actually make something happen or at least give it my best shot.
Well, thank you. I just thank you for really seriously putting that effort forth and moving your grief and pain into something positive.
Yeah. I think that's really the only way forward, right? As long as we're alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I thank you so much for speaking with me. Like it's such a, as traumatized as I am by the experience, speaking to other medical professionals, to hospice professionals, it's tremendously helpful. There is something very healing about being able to talk about this story with other people who really do understand how the system is supposed to work when it works well.
It's supposed to help you. It's supposed to protect you.
Right.
Oh my goodness. I am grateful to have you on the show. And is there a way my audience can reach out to you?
So, yeah, you can find me on social media. I'm on Instagram and TikTok under Distinguished Heathen. That's all one word. And I do have a campaign, a GoFundMe campaign going right now for caregiver protections in hospice. Can also send a link to that because this is effectively
Sure.
my unpaid job for the coming year. So it will fund all
Yep.
of the travel and all of the awareness raising efforts around Marsha's Law if people are interested in supporting. But yeah, pretty easy to find on socials under that tag. And yeah, I'm just hoping to spread the word and get more support as we go along.
I am honestly probably on one of my rare moments, more just stunned into silence. I just thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for sharing your story. And Marsha's Law, that's what we need to look forward to, hearing more about that. I'd be happy to have you come back and let us get an update
Oh,
here.
I'd love that. Yeah, I'm
That would be
hoping
wonderful.
I'm hoping in the new year we will start getting some momentum and have those updates. Nothing's happening
Well,
around the
and
holidays. I know that.
no.
So,
But, whenever it is, just you can email me and just say, "Hey, it's time to come back," and I'll be okay.
oh, Marie, thank you so much for having me. And
You're welcome.
that will be a very happy day. So.
Yes.
Thank you for joining me on Hospice Explained. Think about ways you can make a difference in someone's life. Also, please subscribe and share this podcast with anyone who would benefit from listening. Thank you.